So now, please welcome our third speaker of this afternoon, Professor Philip Cunningham. He's professor of theology, specializing in Christian-Jewish relations, and director of the Institute of Jewish-Catholic Relations of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. He has served as president of the International Council of Christians and Jews and on the Advisory Committee on Catholic-Jewish Relations for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Interested in biblical studies, religious education, and theologies of Christian-Jewish relations, he is the author of numerous books and articles on these subjects. Closely connected with the paper and his presentation of today is his doctoral dissertation, a content analysis of the presentation of Jews and Judaism in current Roman Catholic religion textbooks. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the introduction. I'd like to join all of the previous speakers at our conference in thanking Joseph Sievers, both for the invitation and for organizing this conference, whose significance I think we all appreciate in today's world. Joe and I have known each other for, I realize, like 20 years, believe it or not, and have been involved in a number of different research projects transatlantically over those years. So it really is a delight and an honor to be with you. I'd also, of course, like to thank the Biblicum for organizing and sustaining the conference, as well as I teach at a Jesuit university in Philadelphia, and so our sister Jesuit university at the Greg here, it's wonderful to be with you. As you know, I also should thank Joe for the title of my presentation, the play on words on a textbook case. What I would like to begin with is to explain that what I'm going to present is the results of several different studies of how Pharisees, and by extension others of Jesus' Jewish contemporaries, are depicted and discussed in Catholic and, in a brief aside, some Protestant religion textbooks. So the first source, as we just heard, is from my 1992 doctoral dissertation, a content analysis of how Jews and Judaism were presented in Catholic textbooks. And I'll explain what a content analysis is as we go along. One of the nice things about the dissertation was that it had a clear focus, and those of you preparing to work on dissertations, having a clear focus is really an important thing. And it was able to replicate a study using the same methodology by Dr. Eugene Fisher, which he had conducted in the 1970s. There was also a previous set of studies of a different methodology, but still useful, by the late Sister Rose Thering, who looked at Catholic textbooks before the Second Vatican Council. And so it's possible to chart, literally, as you will see, the changes over a span of several decades, including, of course, the pivotal contribution of Nostra Aetate. At the same time I was working on my dissertation, another PhD candidate named Stuart Polly used the same methodology with some adaptations I'll refer to look at Protestant textbooks in the United States, asking the same sorts of questions. In 1995, my dissertation was published in a more popular vein under the title of Education for Shalom. And in between the completion of my dissertation and the preparation of it for publication, the Catechism of the Catholic Church was published. And so for the book publication, I replicated the study I had done on textbooks using the same methodology and criteria on the Catechism in order to have a basis of comparison between these two educational collections. In the past year, I took samples of high school and junior high school religion textbooks that are currently in use in the United States, subjected them to the same methodological analysis. This is by no means exhaustive, but I think it's fairly representative of the publications that are very widely used in the United States. In addition, Dr. Maria Bruti, who's sitting there in the 4th row, was kind enough to do a similar search of some current Italian Catholic textbooks, and we'll see how those results compare. In all cases, I'll give you one of the conclusions as we begin, the presentation of the Pharisees remains challenging, though the reasons for that, I think, are very readily identifiable. And I'll have some recommendations about that at the conclusion. Now, I would like to move fairly quickly through explaining the methodology and get to the results, but I'll say a few brief words about the methodology. Basically, this was reading through all primary and secondary level Catholic religion textbooks used both in Catholic schools and in parish religious education programs, including their teachers' manuals, because the teacher manuals, of course, provide supplementary information. Over 3,000 lessons were assessed, and all references to Jews and Judaism were evaluated according to criteria developed from Catholic ecclesiastical documents issued from Nostra Aetate forward until the 1990s. These would have included, up to that date, the guidelines and the notes, as we typically abbreviate them, from the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, documents of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, particularly the Historical Truth of the Gospels, which goes through the 3 stages of gospel development in the first century, and the Bible and Christology from 1984. Pope John Paul II was in the middle of his 26-year-long papacy, but had already spoken about Jews and Judaism to such an extent that a volume of his essays had already been published. And there were statements from many national bishops' conferences that were relevant to Jewish-Christian relations. I've only listed some of them here to fit it all on one slide, to be honest. But these include from the French bishops, the West German bishops, the Polish bishops, and from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, which had, as you can see, issued a number 3 relevant documents or statements by the time of doing this study. When the reference to Jews and Judaism was detected or seen in a lesson, they were evaluated according to the criteria that I will mention in a moment, and also sorted into categories. So there might be references to Jews and Judaism regarding a lesson on the Old Testament. That Old Testament lesson, for example, if it was discussing the book of Exodus, might show a modern Jewish family celebrating a Seder meal, in which case that reference would fall into 2 different categories, Old Testament and also Jews Today was the name of the category. And they were judged to be either positive or negative, by which which is a statistical terminology. By that we don't mean it's nice or it's not nice, or it's favorable or it's unfavorable, but whether it was accurate according to the criteria that were used for the particular category, as you will see. So the categories that references were allocated into were Hebrew Bible, New Testament, Rabbinic Judaism, Reformation to the 20th century, historical references, 20th century references, and Judaism or Jews in general or today. Theme categories were Jesus as a Jew, the Jewishness of Jesus being discussed in the lesson, Jesus and the Jews, meaning how was Jesus' relationship to contemporaries portrayed, the Pharisees, which of course is what we'll zero in on today, the crucifixion, the notion that Jews were under a divine curse for the crucifixion of Jesus or for other reasons, the Shoah, the state of Israel, relationships of the covenantal lives of Jews and Christians, and references to the Crusades and the Inquisition. Not only were these references analyzed according to whether they were positive or negative, but also the frequency with which Jews were mentioned in these categories was also assessed. The latter thing yields what's called a preoccupation score. What percentage of lessons referred to Jews and Judaism at all, and how many referred to Jews or Judaism in these particular categories. The positive and negative references are put into this statistical formula to give what's called a general imbalance score. The number of positive references and the number of negative references are subtracted and are divided by those numbers added together, and what you end up with is a number somewhere between -1 and +1. So that if all of the references were totally accurate, you would end up with a +1 imbalance score. If they were all negative, it would be -1. And if they canceled each other out, the number of positive and negative references, or if they were all just very neutral, then you would have a 0. So the ideal would be to have many scores above 0, meaning a positive general imbalance when Jews and Judaism are referred to in these specific categories. Here are the categories that were used in '92 and also by the Stewart-Polly analysis and the more recent surveys that we did, according to the documents from the church that were available at that time. Are the Pharisees portrayed objectively, according to the best information we have, as having commonalities with Jesus, or are they portrayed stereotypically as legalists, hypocrites, and all of the things we've been talking about this week, as totally dissimilar and alien, hostile to Jesus? Were they portrayed as composed of various schools, such as those of Hillel and Shammai? Was a non-monolithic presentation of the Pharisees to be found? Or are they portrayed monolithically as all the same, as a collective block with a unanimous point of view on things? Were comments about Pharisees projected onto Jews at large, the Jewish community in general? Were they portrayed as leaders in a time of great upheaval and diversity in the land of Israel in the late Second Temple period? Or are they always in negative contrast to Jesus and to the later church? Is the interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees shown to be both positive and negative, or is it always portrayed as negative? And you probably can't see the little footnotes there, but each of these criteria can be grounded in one of the Post Nostra Aetate ecclesiastical documents that I mentioned before. So this chart will show you what the results were for American textbooks, all of which being used in the late 1980s into the early 1990s. One caution I want to make statistically is that this does not give necessarily, it does not factor in which textbook series were the most commonly used. It turns out that the ones that scored better were the more popular ones, or the ones most widely used, and those that scored negatively were not so widely used, but there was no real way to assess that because the textbook publishers were strangely reluctant to give that information as to how much they were being used. So here's the chart for, from the Eugene Fisher study in 1976. You'll notice that the category of Jesus as a Jew scores really rather well, plus 0.87. Whereas the category of Jesus and other Jews, the Pharisees, and the crucifixion are all in the negative zone, and the Pharisees being the most negative of those, and I'll explain why with some sample quotes in a minute. The 1992 study yielded this result. And you can see the general shape of the graph is the same, but it's higher up. It's more positive than the measures that were obtained 15 years prior in the Fisher study. It's sort of interesting to me when I did this initially that the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible categories all generally worked out fairly positively, but New Testament materials were the ones that were scoring negatively, and of course it's because of these three themes of the Pharisees, Jesus and other Jews, and the crucifixion. Let's take a look at a couple of quotations from those studies. Pharisees were devout laypersons. However, they were powerful religious leaders. They believed that Judaism was a religion based on the strict observance of the law. They looked down on the poor and uneducated because they felt that these people were not strict enough about the law and compromised with the Romans. This is from a series that scored generally rather well, but you'll see familiar tropes appearing when talking about the Pharisees. A first-person declaration. I am Zechariah the Pharisee. I have studied the law of Moses since I was a child. I go to the temple every day to teach and to study the law. I fast. I keep all the rules. I am better than anybody else. Others respect me. They bow when I pass. The little code there, you won't, but this is from a 4th grade religion textbook. Whenever Jesus, the new king of Israel, went, wherever Jesus, the new king of Israel, went, he was followed about by angry men who argued with him because they did not like what he was saying or doing. Some of these men were Pharisees. Some of the Pharisees were so concerned with the special laws that God had given them through Moses that they often forgot about loving God and others. Instead, they thought only of themselves. They thought they were perfect, and they wanted to look perfect by following every law without making one little teeny mistake. But their hearts were cold, proud, and unloving. Again, a 4th grade textbook, which I find kind of amazing. But I want to interject something here in case I forget to say it later. Many times, textbooks will say some of the Jewish leaders or some of the Pharisees or some of whatever group is the question, but they rarely depict some of the others who do something different. In other words, you only get a qualifier for the negatively described characters. You never actually encounter a good Pharisee, let's say. Secondary series had as a student activity suggested in the teacher's manuals to do a Bible search and to look up all of these passages and to write what you discover in the passages. This is the answer key that's in the teacher's manual, all right? The Pharisees watched Jesus because they were, I'm not going to read the whole thing, you can see, right? You end up with this long laundry list of negative things about and it's all specifically the Pharisees and their nasty doings. This is from a teacher's manual for a freshman high school book, as I recall. Let me refer to the Stuart Poly study of Protestant textbooks. I didn't graph these because they'll be a little bit more difficult, but the numbers, again, you can see that the numbers that are in red are negative numbers, meaning that the way that Jews and Judaism are described, the ways that Pharisees are described, are all quite negative. For the publications at the top of the chart, they sort of gradually get a bit more positive as you go down the chart, and that is roughly corresponding to a move from more evangelical Christian denominations to more mainline or mainstream Protestant denominations in the United States. Again, you see the same problems, and I'll give you some more overall conclusions in a moment. One of the things that was sort of interesting, I don't quite know what to make of it, but at the very bottom you see combined senior and junior high Protestant evaluations from the Poly study and Catholic primary and secondary, so we're not exactly comparing the same thing, but there seems to be much more many more references to Jews and Judaism in the Catholic text than there were in the Protestant text, and that struck me funny then, and it still strikes me a little funny now, but anyhow, for what that's worth. I have to point out something that that was discovered by the Christian Scholars Group on Christian-Jewish relations, to which I belong, about 2 years ago. There's something online that I'm folding in here. It's not exactly a textbook, but it's sort of a very vivid example of some problems in evangelical Protestant texts in the United States, or materials in the United States. Husband and wife team apparently manufactured this thing called the Pharisee game. And picture this. You live in a distant land many centuries ago. You've recently begun following a controversial new prophet called Jesus. And the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees, aren't very happy about it. Can the disciples find and excommunicate the Pharisees in their midst before they try and stone them all? Now, this is so far beyond the bounds of anything in the New Testament, but apparently this is, you'll notice they have a GoFundMe page that had a goal of $4,000 and they've raised $21,000, which means they're selling this religious education tool that specifically is caricaturing the Pharisees as sort of the demonic antitypes to Christianity and to Jesus. Eek, the technical word. Moving on to some conclusions about the United States textbook study from '92. Catholic text compared longitudinally over the Thering study in the 50s, the Fisher study in the mid-70s, and mine in the late 80s and 90s. Almost all of the Adversus Judaeos stuff is gone in its extreme form. So, for example, in the Thering study, you had quotes in a second grade Spanish textbook, a textbook from Spain that said, Pilate tried everything he could do to save Jesus from the bloodthirsty Jews. That is gone. I mean, it's just totally gone. You can't find that either in the Fisher study or in my later study, which I interpret to be a positive consequence of having a centralized teaching magisterium in the Catholic Church. What remains, however, there are still problems, is sporadic, disjointed polemic, and particularly the uncritical use of certain New Testament passages that we can all name, I'm sure. The vast majority, as I just said, resulted from the negative use of the Bible in the textbook lessons. To sum up the Protestant texts from the late 80s and 90s, both Jewish topics in general and the Pharisees in particular scored much more negatively than the Catholic texts. I suspect because of it's not having a centralized sort of guidepost to regulate the curriculum. Jewish topics had higher negative scores in evangelical texts than in liberal or quote-unquote mainline Protestant ones, as I mentioned. And as I say, the centralized teaching magisterium in the Catholic community, I think, is a positive factor here. And also the fact that since Divino Afflante Spiritu in 1943, the Catholic community has, at least theoretically, committed itself to biblical criticism, and I'll have more to say about that. Some quotations from the current American textbooks that I reviewed. This is from a prayer service at the end of a lesson in a ninth grade religion text. And the celebrant or the presider at the prayer service would say this: Jesus Christ, everyone who faces him, is faced with the decision, is he God or isn't he? Either he is our Savior or he isn't. Whatever we decide about him involves a risk. Our whole life is at stake. Do you, again, you should picture this, a group of students in an auditorium at prayer. This is the homiletic challenge being presented to them. Do you choose to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or do you think he was a liar, a fool, a failure? And then there's, the celebrant goes on to say, people who knew him reacted to him in different ways. And then there's an antiphonal response by the right and the left side of the congregation or the student assembly. Side one, the Pharisee said, he drives out demons by the prince of demons. Peter said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. The Pharisee said, look and see that no prophet arises from the Galilee. Some Jewish people said, we are not stoning you for a good work, but for blasphemy. You, man, are making yourself God. We recognize the Johannine passage that's lurking behind that one. But again, you see the tendency to have polarized binary opposition to Jesus, and the Pharisees are leading the pack on the negative side. Another quick example from current texts. Jesus faced difficulties throughout his public life. Sometimes people didn't want to understand or accept him. From the beginning, the religious leaders watched his every move with suspicion. They did not like his popularity and his criticism of their rigid view of the law. The adjectives rigid and strict are sort of the red flags for me when I'm reading these things. Instead of being open and changing their narrow-minded attitudes, they gradually built up a wall of opposition. Now, in the textbook, I didn't replicate this, there's a diagram or a chart that's composed of stones making a wall, and the student is invited to write inside those stones these particular elements that I will present to you now. In some cases, they pick up stones to throw at Jesus. They ask Jesus to get out of town. They claim he has power from the devil. They accused him of blasphemy. I want to highlight that blasphemy charge because that's significant in a number of ways. Try to throw Jesus off a cliff. They look for him a way to put him to death. So again, you see that they're cherry picking, as we would say, particular polemical passages in the New Testament in 4 different Gospels and combining them together in this rather noxious way. I'm going to skip over some of these because you kind of get the idea, and I would like to make sure that we have time for the suggestions and recommendations I'd like to offer. Excuse me, I'll leave that there for 1 second. This is a speed reading quiz, and I'm going to move on. Finally, one last quotation. I want to mention this, even though it's not exactly the Pharisees, but here is a student activity. List 5 Old Testament prophecies that are fulfilled in Jesus' passion narratives. And the teacher's guide suggests these answers that you can see. This is typical of an uncritical use of the New Testament, that it's simply read as a flat historical transcript of the events of Jesus' execution, and the presumption that biblical prophecy is totally predictive of the details of events that are realized in the life of Jesus, even though it's widely understood in exegetical circles that the gospel writers also depicted the death of Jesus in ways that would mirror the biblical prophecies from the Tanakh. So, highlight again the uncritical use of the Bible. From Dr. Brudi's evaluation of some Italian texts, I'll go through this quickly as well. The Pharisees were a strong and well-organized group composed mainly of peasants, artisans, and merchants who had arrogated the task of guarding the law and interpreting it also in the light of changes in society. And it seems to me that in many of these quotations, there's an interest in giving a sociological grounding for what's said about Pharisees, which I think is kind of interesting. The Pharisees were very religious and faithful in the observance of the Sabbath, the rules of purity, and the payment of taxes for the temple. Okay. Jesus repeatedly accused them of being hypocrites, that is, of respecting the law of Moses only formally without bothering about the true spirit of God's commandments. Now, again, these are the same patterns that are in the American textbooks. There's nothing specifically Italian about this, but what you see, I think that's fascinating, is an effort to give a somewhat objective, according to the best knowledge of the authors, a description or characterization of the Pharisees, but the sort of gravitational pull of the default position, the oppositional position, can't quite be resisted, and you end up with sentences like the last one. Another example, the greatest reproach that Jesus addresses to the scribes, the Pharisees, and the priests, so this is another issue of concatenating the different Jewish groups, is that of not respecting the law. Far from it, being a Jew himself and a practicing Jew, so that we get a positive assessment in the Jesus as a Jew category, he recognizes the merit of one who follows the Mosaic law. Okay, that's pretty good. But Jesus rebuked them because wanting to fulfill the 613 precepts and prohibitions of the Torah in an exceedingly scrupulous manner, they ended up losing sight of the deeper meaning, that which gives it soul, namely love. Scribes, Pharisees, and priests, instead of loving, have become teachers of obedience. Instead of children loved by the Father, they had become slaves. Thus, the law ended up stifling love. Okay, you get the idea. But I do want to say there are efforts in many recent textbooks to give somewhat of an objective presentation. You'll see the longer quote here about the Pharisees, although you have the etymological separated ones issue appearing here. I'm going to speed along. Some general observations from Dr. Brudi about the Italian text. Materials about Pharisees is very scarce. And I'm reminded in Christian's presentation about Oberammergau, you had mentioned that one strategy might simply be to remove the Pharisees at all from the Passion play. And of course, there's some reasons for that because they appear so rarely in the Passion narrative, so that makes some sense. But I also see in the textbooks a tendency of the authors and or publishers not to try and get into controversial subjects and just not treat them at all. And that may be one of the reasons why the Pharisees are showing up so infrequently. But it also happens with the crucifixion, which in some ways is more significant. In other words, in many of the textbooks, it's just presumed that students know that Jesus was crucified, and there's no treatment of to how that came to pass or why it was. They kind of are staying away from it, recognizing that it's fraught. The Pharisees are rather generically described for their observance of the law, and it's called the law, not the Torah, which also is not insignificant. Sometimes there's a mention of the oral tradition. Similarities to Jesus are not mentioned. Sometimes there's stereotypes. I'm going to speed on because I'm recognizing the time is past or coming close. On the sample American texts, Pharisees were mentioned in about 15% of the high school textbook lessons that I sampled. Again, uncritical use of the New Testament text remains a major issue. Opposition to Jesus by some Jews is anachronistically attributed to debates about his divine sonship. As we saw in one of those quotes, do you believe that he is the Son of God or is he a liar? That's fraught with problems exegetically. But of course, this is a post-resurrectional controversy and should not be retrojected back into the life of Jesus himself. The Catechism of the Catholic Church in 94 is an important factor here, and I'll just mention this. I indicated that I applied the same methodological tool to the Catechism as used in the 1992 textbooks. This is the combined result of primary and secondary textbooks on the Pharisees from 92. You recognize the shape of the graph. More positive than in previous studies, but here's how the Catechism shapes up. So, same general shape of the curve, but the Catechism is more negative than, score-wise, than the generic or average of Catholic textbooks in the U.S. Here, the reason is primarily because the Catechism doesn't always apply the same biblical critical standards that it states Catholics ought to be using, but it doesn't actually employ them itself in their discussion of the Pharisees. There's this paragraph, which is I want to praise in paragraph number 575 of the Catechism. You'll see the blue text is from the 1985 Vatican Notes. It's almost a direct quotation, although it's not cited. That talks about Jesus having some similarities with the Pharisees, and they weren't always fighting each other and that sort of thing. But then you get things like this. Now, let me go on to another one. Again, time is passing. Jesus could not help but offend the teachers of the law, for he was not content to propose his interpretation alongside theirs, but taught the people as one who has an authority, not as one of their scribes. The issue of divine authority kicks in here. Let me just mention three issues with the Catechism, and here's why this is important for at least United States textbooks. After the Catechism came out, all religion textbook publishers had to submit their drafts of their next series to a committee set up by the U.S. bishops called the Committee on the Catechism. That committee had to approve the textbooks as in conformity with the Universal Catechism in order for them to give its approval for its publication. So textbook publishers, whom I worked with a little bit during my dissertation a few years earlier, who are cognizant of things like the 85 notes and the 74 guidelines, those as criteria were kind of disappeared because the Catechism became the sole measuring rod for the orthodoxy of the Catholic religion textbooks. And so as a result, you have things like this. This is the Catechism on the top. Jesus performed acts such as pardoning sins, showed him to be the Savior, God himself. Certain Jews who did not recognize God made man, again, contemporaneously with Jesus is the thing here, saw him only as a man who made himself God and judged him as a blasphemer. Of course, the notes from 85 say the Gospels are the outcome of long and complicated editorial work, and that some of the controversies are reflecting things long after. We've heard this quoted a couple of times during our conference. A second example of these problems. How Jews understand their own tradition is not considered much in the Catechism, and except in this kind of funny way. On their own admission, the Jews were never able to observe the law in its entirety without violating the least of its precepts. That's why on the Day of Atonement, the Israelites asked God's forgiveness for their transgressions, and there's a quotation from James about being guilty of everything, but the guidelines from 74 state Christians have to understand how Jews understand themselves in the light of their own religious experience. I don't think there's many Jews who understand themselves in the light of the description given in the Catechism paragraph. So how do you put these two things together? I'm sorry I'm speaking so fast. I hope these contrasts are making sense. And finally, this one, by way of contrast, there are these scattered throughout the Catechism, there are these sort of gratuitous remarks that really don't fit in the overall context, but which are problematic. The new law is a law of love because it makes us act out of love infused by the Spirit rather than from fear. A law of freedom because it sets us free from the ritual and juridical observances of the old law, inclines us to act spontaneously by the prompting of charity, and finally lets us pass from the condition of a servant to that of a son and heir. Well, it seems to me that's in direct contradiction to what the guidelines to implement a conciliar document said. And I mention that because that gives it a certain amount of authority. In 1974, the Old Testament and the Jewish tradition based upon it must not be set against the New Testament in such a way that the former seems to be only a religion of justice, fear, and legalism with no appeal to love of God and neighbor. Well, that seems to me is what paragraph 1972 in the Catechism is precisely doing. What are textbook publishers supposed to do, right? They have I'm not trying to accuse them, but when they're faced with these sort of ambivalent guidelines or only partially represented guidelines, you can understand why they might want to touch the topic with the 10-foot pole. Let me end with quotes from the notes from 85 that are quite relevant. Jews and Judaism are central to Christian identity and therefore should not occupy an occasional or marginal place in catechesis. From the preoccupation scores, it's clear they do occupy a marginal or sideline place in catechesis. So we've got some work to do in this department. Work that is of poor quality and lacking in precision would be extremely detrimental to Jewish-Christian dialogue, says John Paul II, but not just to the dialogue, but to Christianity's self-understanding itself would be damaged by inaccurate presentations of Jews and Judaism. Conclusion. Presentation of the Pharisees, specifically, and of late Second Temple Jewish folk generally, continues to be problematic in textbooks in the USA, in Italy, and presumably in other places too. Secondly, the uncritical use of New Testament texts, including in teachers' manuals, is a real problem. The Catechism is unhelpful in this regard. And three, the impression given, as I just said, is that textbook publishers want to avoid getting too much into the weeds on certain issues, and I think that inclines them then to just simply fall back on the default position of traditional anti-Jewish supersessionism. Recommendations. Textbook publishers cannot avoid the critical exegetical issues, but they also need to be given clear guidelines in treating such topics as blasphemy. Blasphemy in the time of Jesus and in the context of his ministry and activity would have an entirely different meaning than violating monotheism, as becomes the case later on in the first century. That never appears in any textbook, that distinction. Obviously, we should use the best historical knowledge about the Pharisees that we have. We all know after the last few days there's a lot we don't know, but there is stuff that we do know, and sometimes the via negativa is the better way to go. There are things about the Pharisees that we should not be saying, even if we cannot be so precise on exactly how they felt either individually or in subgroups about certain issues. I think that textbook authors and publishers need to confer with experts on Jewish perspectives and sources. And in this regard, let me end with my last quotation. This is again from the 85 Notes. And again, my general perspective here is that sadly the notes, which can be improved now after 30 years or whatever, nonetheless have sort of been shoved to the side because of the overwhelming predominance of the influence of the Catechism. But listen to this quotation, the last one. Religious teaching, catechesis, and preaching should be a preparation not only for objectivity, justice, and tolerance, but also for understanding and dialogue. Mutual knowledge must be encouraged at every level. There is evident in particular, this is 1985, a painful ignorance of the history and traditions of Judaism, of which only negative aspects and often caricatures seem to form part of the stock ideas of many Christians, end quote. Sadly, that quotation still applies today. For different reasons perhaps than in the 80s, but nonetheless something that needs attention. Thank you very much for your attention.